This is James Taylor, and you're listening to The Creative Life. The Creative Life podcast is a show created for you, the creative. If you're looking for inspiration, motivation, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's a musician, writer, artist, designer, performer, educator, or creative entrepreneur. They share their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, their insights, and much, much more. In this episode, I speak with cognitive scientist Art Markman. We discuss motivation, goal setting, improvisation, and much, much more. Enjoy this episode. Hey, it's James Taylor. I'm delighted today to have Art Markman. Art is Professor of Psychology and Marketing at the University of Texas at Austin and founding director of the program in the Human Dimensions of Organizations. He has written over 150 scientific papers on reasoning, decision-making, and motivation, as well as several books on creativity, behavior change, and general psychology. Art's research explores how we think. He has made a lifetime study of how people form and use analogies, the mechanisms of decision-making, and how our motivation affects our reasoning. However, when he's not doing things related to the cognitive sciences, you might just find him playing sax in a blues or a ska band in his hometown of Austin, Texas. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Art onto the show today. Welcome, Art.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks so much.
So share with our listeners, what are you working on just now? What's going on in your world?
You know, I'm working on all kinds of things. On the education side, I run this program called the Human Dimensions of Organizations. I'm really interested in trying to help people in their work lives to think a little bit differently about the people that they encounter, because it's so fascinating that we train people to think for a living. We get people to think for a living, but actually they have no idea how their own minds work or other people's minds work. So I'm focused on that. I'm also focused on a lot of the research that I'm doing right now in continuing work that I'm doing in human decision making. And then I spend a lot of time trying to bring my field outward to as many people as I can. You know, it's great to be here with you today. I have my own podcast, and so that occupies a lot of my time.
Where did this interest in the cognitive sciences and the kind of work that you do today, where did it stem from? Was there a kind of key moment in your life you said that this is the area that I want to go with my work, or was there something that happened even going back to school days of just saying this, I'm really passionate about learning this part of science?
I went to college like so many people, not being too sure what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I would study physics or economics, and as I like to say, I took economics and I didn't like it, and then I took physics and it didn't like me. And a couple of years into college, when I had to declare a major, I realized I wasn't sure which field I wanted to go into, and I told an advisor that I had taken a little psychology and thought it was cool, but wasn't sure I wanted to be a psychologist, and had taken some computer science and liked that, but wasn't sure I wanted to be a computer scientist. Took some anthropology, some linguistics, some philosophy, liked all those, wasn't sure I wanted to go into those fields. And the advisor looked down and said, everything you listed is part of the major in cognitive science. Maybe you're a cognitive scientist. And I decided to pursue that, and it turned out to be absolutely the right thing. And I have just loved, it's been probably 27 years since that moment now, and I've just loved every minute of it.
And when you first went into the field, who were those early mentors or the people whose work really inspired you and that just kind of lit you up as a scientist?
I have been lucky enough to interact with all kinds of interesting people, and then just to read fascinating things. Early in my career, I was an undergraduate at Brown. I hung out with people like Jim Anderson, who were doing early work in neural networks, which really exploded onto the scene, and that was really fascinating to me. My graduate advisors, Dedrick Gentner, Doug Medine, had a profound influence on the way that I think. I've just really been, reading voraciously for years. I mean, going back to, reading philosophy by people like Dan Dennett, reading psychology experiments. I mean, obviously the kind of seminal work of people like Kahneman and Tversky had a huge influence on the way that I think about things. And, and then over the years, really trying to just continue to branch into different fields. So while I was teaching at Columbia University, I had several students from the marketing department who came over and got introduced to work in consumer behavior, and really, I think, loved a lot of that kind of work, in part because it had a practical element, but in part because one of the things that psychology experiments suffer from is that everybody goes into a psychology experiment kind of second guessing it, trying to figure out what the trick is. And when you show them a bunch of ads or something like that, they drop their guard. And so you can study almost exactly the same things, only you tell people that it's in the context of studying ads, and now they're focused on the product and not trying to figure out how this is an intelligence test.
And I know, so a lot of the work you're doing, it seems you're very passionate about this idea of research not just being left in dry academic books and in the labs, but actually taking this information and talking to people about it and kind of spreading the word about some of the really interesting findings and research that's coming out, and talking to people about how it can relate to their own lives.
Yeah, I think it's so important to do that. I think no matter what field people are in, if they're doing research, I think that there's a need to communicate it more broadly. And I just think that need is particularly important when it comes to the cognitive sciences, because so much of the work that we do on a daily basis, everyone, that is the work that everyone's asked to do, requires thinking. And yet people know so little about the way that they think that I believe people will live their lives differently and better if they know more about the way that they think. And there's clearly a hunger for it. If you look at business magazines, probably half of the articles that are published in those magazines are psychology articles. If you look at the podcast world, there's a huge amount of information that's getting out there about the cognitive sciences. People desperately want this information, and I think it's important that those of us who are in the field as scientists do what we can to bring it out there.
And one of your books, Smart Change, you talk about these 5 ways that we can alter our behavior to kick bad habits and develop good ones. Where did that book, the idea for that book, come from? And can you just talk about a little bit about its development? Because you're spending your entire days in very kind of deep kind of research work, and then I'm guessing you have to kind of switch gears a little bit and create a book that anyone can just pick up, and they can get the kind of key tips and the kind of resources from it and start implementing it in their own lives.
Yeah, I think, the book actually came initially from, I have spent a lot of time over the years talking to people from companies, because companies often have a little bit of money to spend on getting some training for their employees. And one of the things that came up over and over again in talking with companies was how much they wanted to help people to change their behavior, both in the workplace and at home, and that they were having trouble getting people to do that effectively. And so I really decided to take a step back and think about this from the science standpoint. And what I love to do is to find ways to take the research that's out there and to distill it in a way that is both scientifically accurate, but also easy to understand. For me, it was a matter of taking the motivational system, all of these brain mechanisms, and recognizing that fundamentally there is both a go system, which is a system of a set of brain systems deep in the brain that drive you to act and engage your goals, and then a stop system, which is a second brain system that runs through the frontal lobes of the brain that takes behaviors that go system is engaged and tries you to stop you from doing them in those situations in which you've now decided that action is no longer a good one to perform, and that it's important to understand that for a variety of reasons that stop system is less effective than the go system, and that your ultimate goal in trying to change behavior is to reprogram that go system rather than to rely on the stop system. That's a fairly accurate way to say that with respect to the science. It's a fairly straightforward way of thinking about it, and I think it helps to frame the question of behavior change in a way that makes sense and gives people a way of then thinking about how to do that effectively.
Fascinating. And with the kind of work that you're working, the kind of things that you're doing now, obviously we're seeing this big trend towards automation with robots. I was talking recently, they were just talking about how many jobs are really not going to be there in the next few years because of automation. When you're starting to see the trends that are happening, whether it's the rise of creativity as a skill, like I know the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, they were talking about that creativity as a skill going from number 10 to number 3, and how people are having to change in the workplace. What are some of the key skills that you're seeing that are really kind of fascinating you in the cognitive sciences work that you do, that you think that people maybe overlook, or they need to spend a little bit more time investigating and working on themselves?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, creativity is one important element. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with that question, though, and also say that I think that really developing good people skills in the workplace is something that's extraordinarily important and I think harder than it looks. We often put people into larger organizations. They succeed in some technical aspect of their job, and so we reward them by giving them the opportunity to manage people. And we don't really give people the tools that they need, the skills that they need to be effective in understanding the people who are working for them, understanding how those people differ from themselves, and then giving them an opportunity to really influence other people's behavior. And so I believe that one of the things that's going to become increasingly crucial over the years is over the coming years is really going to be to help people to understand the other people that they're working with in order to help to maximize the capacity that they get out of those people while still giving them a fulfilling work life.
And so is that like understanding? I know personality tests, and I've seen lots of organizations that use personality testing so you know the other personality types, for example, of other people in your team, so you can have a better understanding of people like Edward de Bono, you know, the black hat and all the different colors hats and things as well. Is that part of it, or are there things that are coming out of the research which maybe aren't getting used so much in the business in the corporate world, but you think are going to start becoming a bigger part of that scene?
Yeah, I mean, certainly personality characteristics are a piece of it. The problem with focusing primarily on personality is that we know from the literature that differences in personality predict about 10 to 15% of the difference in what people are going to do across people, which means you're still missing about 85% of what's going on. So I would say that on top of that, there are several other things that are important. I think that it's important for people to understand what happens when you have a good conversation with someone else. We do so much now by text and by email that we fail to recognize the value that one-on-one and small group conversations have in synchronizing the way that different people think about the things that they're doing and in helping people to feel more closely connected to the other people that they work with. So I think that there are things like the value of direct communication that are going to be important. I think there's a lot of work on motivation, some of which comes out of the work on positive psychology, some of which comes out of the social psychology literature on motivation, that really tells us several important things. For example, we need to learn to read other people's emotions to understand what motivations are driving them. I think we talk about emotional intelligence, but we don't really understand, most of us, that emotions are actually created from feelings that come out of your motivational system. That when you are trying to achieve a goal, when you are succeeding, you feel good. When you're failing, you feel bad. The strength of that feeling depends on how engaged you are with the goal. So already, just from the kind of emotion someone's experiencing, you can get a sense of whether they feel like they're succeeding or failing and how well. On top of that, the specific type of emotion that people experience depends on which motivational system is active. So if you are succeeding at achieving something desirable, you feel happy. But if you succeed at avoiding a potential danger, you're not happy, you're relieved, which is a very different emotion. So the point is that I think there's some much deeper elements of our thinking and our psychology broadly that come out of research that still haven't diffused themselves through the workplace.
And in terms of your own creative process as a cognitive scientist, where do you go to get fresh inspiration? Do you have a kind of process in terms of working through your own ideas? Obviously, you're the world in which you're working. I'm guessing you're pulling on lots of different types of science and lots of different types of research, but where is the place that you can often find that kind of that wellspring of inspiration, and how do you begin kind of trying to find ways of developing that into really kind of solid ideas?
Yeah, I think two of the most important things that I do, I like to spend a lot of time reading, And I think it's hard to do that these days because we often feel kind of guilty about spending too much time on doing something that doesn't feel goal directed, like reading something new, which is one of the reasons why I write a lot of blog entries, because it makes me feel like I've been a little bit more productive to read a new article than put a blog entry up about it. But I also like to hang out with the students in my lab. One of the wonderful things about being in academia is this opportunity to work with students, graduate students, undergraduates, and have discussions with them about the things that they're thinking, get their reactions to ideas, and often that takes things in very different directions than I expected. And so, I think those kinds of collaborations are extraordinarily important, and important also for staying motivated to continue to think differently about things. I think it's easy when you work just by yourself to keep treading over the same ground over and over again. And I think that by interacting with other people and letting their interests infuse what you're working on, it provides a continual growth in the work.
And I mentioned at the top of the show that you also have this passion for music. Being in Austin, I suppose it'd be difficult not to have that passion for music as well. You took up the saxophone in relatively kind of late in life, in your 30s. With your understanding of the cognitive sciences and psychology and motivation and habits, how did you kind of apply this to learning a new instrument at that point in life?
Yeah, I think actually my interest in psychology affected this in several ways. One of which was actually that some of the research on regret was one of the deciding factors in pushing me over the edge to actually start playing. The research on regret suggests that when you look at what old people regret most, it tends to be the things they didn't do in life. Most of the things they did do that went badly just become good stories, but the things they didn't do are things they'll never have a chance to do. And so I thought, well, all right, what will I regret not having done? And I realized one of those things was not playing the saxophone, and that was when I was in my mid-30s, so I started playing. I think another piece of it was recognizing that certainly that it's actually important to do things like practice your scales, because you need to learn habits for those. And while I resisted it a little bit, I certainly decided to put the time in on it. And another thing that I think was important from a motivational standpoint was to recognize that you have to be realistic about your goals. My goal when I took up the saxophone was not to become a virtuoso in 5 years, but really my hope was that in 10 years I wouldn't be horrible. And I've been playing about 16 now, and I think I've achieved the not being horrible.
And with the thing, I know people like Charles Duhigg talk about in habits the idea of triggers, and that the habit actually forms some function as well. Were there ways in which you engineered your daily life to ensure that you would do those scales and do that practicing, and continually kind of move towards where you wanted to get with your playing?
Yeah, I think there were a few things. I mean, one is that I always created a dedicated space in my environment to play.
A dedicated physical space you're talking about.
Physical space in the environment. And the reason for that was that it was always there to remind me that I should be practicing. I mean, now that I've been playing this long, I've moved to a new house in the last 3 years, and I actually built a little studio in the house. And so now I have a location that I can go to. I think another thing that was important was early on when I was playing, I made the decision that I was going to practice every evening right after dinner. And what that did was it created a set of triggers. Basically was finish dinner, wash the dinner dishes, and now it's time to go play the saxophone. And I think that helped a lot. Of course, at this point, it has become a bigger part of my life, playing in a band, and as a result having all of these other people who are relying on me to learn some new things. And, we write songs as a band and things like that. So I think having other people involved in it also enhances that ability to maintain it as a habit and to maintain the desire to want to keep learning more.
Yeah. And with your playing, with just kind of getting those core, scales, that core foundation of knowledge and as a player, was there a point where you got to a stage in your playing where you were able to say, oh, I can actually take what is in my head and get it sounding on the instrument, which, because those two things can often, and I work with a lot of musicians, and some of them have great technical proficiency, but they have nothing to say. Others have lots to say, but they just don't have the technical chops in which to say it. Was there a stage in your playing where you kind of you felt that those married up and they matched up, and you were able to get that, people like, that flow state that people sometimes talk about?
It has finally begun to happen. I think there's the thing about playing an instrument is that there's always something more to learn. And so, you have to balance these two forces, one of which is the one that says you're still not that good yet, keep working. And the other one that says I may not be that good, but I'm not horrible, and so I should also enjoy the products of what I can create. And so riding that, the crest of that wave, I think, is important. I certainly feel like I've gotten to the point now where I walk my dogs. I have two dogs, and I walk my dogs every morning and for long periods of time on weekends. And I often find myself hearing new songs in my head while I'm doing that, and then come scurrying back to the studio afterwards to try and write those down. And that's been a kind of a fun process of writing some stuff for the band, and then having the band work on it and turn it into something more elaborate. And it's just exciting to do that, right? I mean, I think what you're characterizing, that idea of hearing something in your head and ultimately being able to create that. And what's interesting for me, and what I really love about this, is creating it not just on my own instrument, but actually trying to then get the band to play something that I was hearing in my head, and then giving them, because they're all great musicians, an opportunity to improve on it is really wonderful.
You mentioned at the start of the show how we make decisions and the different parts of the brain that are going on as well. I remember seeing or reading about a study with jazz musicians, and I think it was a professor from Harvard working with jazz pianists in this case, and he was looking to find out the people who are good improvisers, why are they better improvisers than maybe other people, and he found an interesting thing, which I think is very similar to comedians, where there was a part in the brain, maybe it was a certain kind of decision-making part of the brain, that a lot of jazz musicians are able to switch off, or good improvisers are able to switch off. The bit in the brain, kind of maybe the critical part, in order to have ideas flow rather than edit as well. I'm sure you obviously in that, because you're very much in this world of thinking about the latest kind of research. Is there anything that you've found in terms of those people who, regardless of whether it's art or music or comedy, for example, what's kind of going on there when they get to a stage where it just flows for them? What's happening in the brain now?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things that you hit on that I think is really important is the willingness to try things to see how they come out. The great improvisers, great comedians, great writers all recognize that you don't start the editing process until after you have generated something. And I think that a lot of people get in their own way by trying to edit on the fly. And the fact is that no writer initially writes a sentence that is a Hemingway sentence. They write a sentence and then they turn it into a Hemingway sentence later. And comedians try their material out on the road and in front of the mirror and with friends. And musicians, great improvisers, do the same thing. I mean, the reason that improvisers spend so much time practicing is they are trying things to see what might work. And I think you have to be willing to do that, and then turn that critical element back on and say, well, given what I created, how could I do this better? What was good? What wasn't so good? And to be your own worst critic on that, but only after you've created something. And I think I can't emphasize enough how important that is for creativity. What we know from all the literature is the people who have the best ideas are the ones who have the most ideas. And so you have to be willing to have those ideas, some of which are going to be horrible, and then be critical enough to recognize when you've had a really good one and to keep it.
And in your life, in your work, has there been a seminal moment, that those kind of insight, we're talking about creativity, those kind of light bulb or aha moments where you've made a decision in terms of the kind of work that you wanted to to pursue in what you were doing, or an area of research you were to pursue, or just a way that you wanted to live? Can you maybe tell us about one of those kind of key insights or light bulb moments in your own life?
Yeah, I'll talk about one from research, which is, and for me, I tend to be very collaborative in the way that I work, and so a lot of the really wonderful moments have come in the context of discussions. And I remember, this is about 15 years ago now, thinking about the idea of categorization, of how do we form categories about the world. And the research in that area for a long time has really been dominated by this idea that the categories that we have are defined by the various features that describe the members of those categories. So, for example, birds tend to have feathers and wings, and they fly and they sing. These are all properties of birds. And the question is, how do we take those properties and in some way combine them to allow us to do a reasonably good job of categorizing something as a bird versus a cat or whatever? And I was having this long conversation, a series of conversations with one of my graduate students at the time. And one of the things that we began to realize as we talked about this more was that view of categories was missing something fundamental. And what it was missing is that many of our categories are not really about the features that things have, but rather about the roles that they play in bigger situations. So, for example, a game is not defined, and there's a famous philosophical discussion by Wittgenstein about how hard it is to come up with the features that define something as a game. And ironically, what Wittgenstein missed in that discussion is that what defines something as a game is that is the role that it plays in a situation. And in particular, if something X or some individual X is playing some other thing Y, that Y is a game. And so it's defined by its role in a situation. You know, that a visitor is the person who comes over to your house, right? And so many of our categories as humans name these roles in these situations. And as soon as we started thinking about this, I mean, I just remember that this opened up a huge line of discussions in the lab. We ended up then writing some papers and ultimately doing a bunch of experiments. And it was just this beautiful moment of recognizing that something had been missing from the discussion for so long, and and then having that as a kind of social experience was really terrific.
So how does that relate then? I mean, you go on Spotify, for example, and there's these categories. You have the jazz category, and then you have the blues category. And it seems to be a lot of the recommendation engines, they totally screw things up. I've yet to find one that actually works, because they're always basing things upon, well, you like this, therefore you like this. And so it always felt like you were just narrowing in all the time, rather than actually having a wider, getting interested in things. So does the work that you do, does that have any kind of relation to that type of categorization, the idea of putting things in boxes all the time?
Well, it could, right? So if you think about it, one of the reasons that those recommendation engines fail is because they actually do this kind of feature-based categorization. They make the assumption that if you liked this song that had a particular beat and was written in a particular era and had, these characteristics to it, that you would like other music that had those same characteristics, as opposed to asking the question, what is the system in which this piece of music falls? And how could I try to find other pieces of music that would serve the same function in that kind of a system? That to me is and that of course requires understanding much more about the context in which somebody's learning music, which is harder because it means you can't just analyze the piece of music. You got to analyze the person and the situation that they're in. But of course, a great recommender does that. If you think about what makes a personal shopper effective, that personal shopper hasn't just learned what clothes fit you. They understand what you want to do with those and how that relates to the way that you want to be viewed in the world, and then chooses things for you that allow you to adopt that role rather than picking things with a particular set of features to them. And that's, I think, that's something that human beings are actually remarkably good at, and machines still are not.
Yeah. We're talking about, I mentioned Spotify there, but do you have any online resources or tools or apps like Evernote or that you love and you couldn't see yourself doing without?
I must admit these days a lot of the just cloud apps, things like Box and Google Drive and stuff like that. That ability to share documents has become so important. Again, I think in part just because I'm extraordinarily collaborative. It's nice to have some of the bibliography software just so you don't have to slog through making a bibliography on your paper at the end of the day. But to me, that the combination of that with the availability of any article you need on the web at any moment is just outstanding. I've been at the University of Texas for 19 years, and my first 4 or 5 years here, I would physically walk into the library about once every 2 or 3 days to pick up an article or a book. And I can't tell you the last time I was in the library because I really don't need to be in the physical space anymore.
And I wonder, I'm seeing this in I was at a bookshop in London the other day, and they're just starting to try and reimagine what bookshops are because things are sort of like libraries as well. And actually, they were categorizing rather than by, let's say, non-fiction, self-help, business. They categorize by feelings instead. So you would have a categories about loss. But once again, I suppose that goes back to still categorizing by roles or by features. Than kind of what you were talking about as well. Where do you see? You're working with these students all the time. When it comes to discovering new things, how are you seeing that these students are discovering things differently than maybe previous generations have?
Well, I think that the basic processes of creativity are really similar. I think that the biggest difficulty now generationally is just getting people over that hump where they realize how much they need to know themselves in order to be creative. I think there's this tendency to think that if stuff is on Wikipedia and if stuff is out on the internet, do I really need to have it in my head? And the answer is yes, because unless you know that information, you can't actually then use it to combine ideas in a way that leads to those new creative insights. And so, to me, it's just getting people, the fact that we have easy access to a lot of these articles doesn't mean everybody's actually reading them. And so I think we need to get people back into that groove of just sitting down and reading a bunch of stuff, even when they don't know if that's going to be relevant. And, I think we have developed a generation of students who are trying to pass the test. And, as a faculty member, I think my least favorite question of all time is when a student comes to me and says, is this going to be on the exam?
Yeah.
And I struggled with that question for a long time and finally realized how to answer it. So now when a student comes to me and says, is this going to be on the exam? I tell them yes, but it might not be my exam.
A wonderful answer. And on the subject of books, if you could recommend just one book and also one record, one album to our listeners, what would they be?
Wow. So if I was going to recommend a book, and are you looking for nonfiction or fiction?
It's completely up to all of our guests go with completely different things, so it's completely up to you.
Yeah. As far I've read a lot of fun, just fascinating books lately. I actually will say that the book I read most recently that I loved was Moonglow, which is Michael Chabon's new book, which I just loved. And so I recommend that, and I'll throw that out as a book.
Great.
As far as albums go, I was having a long conversation with a friend of mine who's a music writer, and I would say here are 4 albums to listen to, and what they have in common is that they were all written towards the end of the artist's lives. or recorded towards the end of the artist's lives. And so from the last year, there's the last album by Leonard Cohen and the last album by David Bowie. And then to reach back a little bit farther, the final albums that were recorded by Johnny Cash and Warren Zevon. Now, what all four of those have in common is that as you listen to them and you think of them as this reflection on that space between life and death, it just provides this perspective that's often hard to get when you're in the middle of another busy day.
It's a little bit like you mentioned at the start. One of the reasons for picking up the saxophone was to deal with that regret thing, not having regrets. And I'm imagining, like with David Bowie, Leonard Cohen, certainly David Bowie. I'm not sure about Leonard Cohen, but he was making that album Black Star when he knew that he was dying.
Yeah.
And how that informs the work that you do. So great. We'll put all these down. People go to jamestaylor.me and just look for Art Markman. You're going to get the links to all these. I'll put all the links there as well. Final question for you, Art. Let's imagine you woke up tomorrow morning and you had to start from scratch. So you have all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows who you are. You know no one. You have to restart. How would you restart?
That's a wonderful question, and I think the first thing I would do is to if I was going to try and stay in the field that I'm in, I would start reaching out to people and just asking them, getting involved in conversations. I think that one of the best things you can do in life is to find those people who can mentor you to the next stage. Those mentors don't necessarily need to be older than you or even more experienced than you. They just need to be people who have something that you don't have and would like to have. And to me, that's what I do is I'd find people who were doing things that I was excited about, and I would reach out to them and try and engage them in conversations.
Wonderful advice. Thank you so much, Art. What is the best way for listeners to connect with you, to find out more about your books and your research and your work?
So you can find out a lot about my books at the website smartthinkingbook.com. People can find me on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I think I'm even on Pinterest. I post links to things I'm writing and other things that I think are interesting, and I always love to hear from people. So if you find me on any of those platforms, feel free to follow and reach out and say hi.
Wonderful. Put all those links in the show notes. Art, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fascinating speaking with you today. I wish you all the best with your research work, and also all the best with your saxophone playing. Hopefully I'll get a chance to hear you live at some point.
Well, thanks, James. It's great to talk to you. And if you come by Austin, Texas, right now my band is called Phineas Gage, and we play around town every now and again.
Hey, James Taylor here again. And if you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me.